6 months ago, I purchased my dream home in Oak Ridge Estates, a picturesque suburban neighborhood with tree-lined streets and meticulously maintained properties. The community seemed perfect, modern, quiet, and just 15 minutes from my office. The Homeowners Association promised to maintain property values and community standards, which sounded reasonable enough when I signed the paperwork. The day I moved in was filled with excitement and promise. After years of saving and planning, I had finally achieved two major life goals: homeownership and purchasing my first electric vehicle. My sleek blue Electra GT represented not just a financial investment, but also a commitment to reducing my carbon footprint. The car was my pride and joy, gleaming in the sunlight as I pulled into my new driveway for the first time. Within my first week at Oak Ridge, I filed the necessary paperwork to install a home charging station. The HOA bylaws required approval for any exterior modifications, so I submitted detailed plans, specifications, and even included photos of how the finished installation would look. The process was surprisingly smooth, and within 2 weeks I received formal approval. The installation team arrived promptly and mounted the charging unit on the exterior wall of my garage, positioned perfectly for convenient access. My first interaction with Karen Jenkins occurred the very day the charging station was installed. She appeared in my driveway unannounced, a woman in her 50s with an immaculate blonde bob and perpetually pursed lips. She introduced herself as the HOA board president with a firm handshake and calculating eyes that assessed every detail of my property. "I see your charging station was installed today," she said, not quite hiding her disapproval despite the board's approval of my application. "These modern contraptions really disrupt the aesthetic harmony of our community." She circled the charging station, inspecting it from every angle. I explained that I had followed all proper protocols and received official approval. Karen nodded stiffly, making a note on her ever-present clipboard. "Just make sure you keep it clean and well-maintained," she warned before departing. "The HOA has strict standards about exterior appearances." For the first month, everything was perfect. My charging routine became second nature: plug in overnight, wake up to a fully charged vehicle, and enjoy emission-free commuting. I tracked my electricity usage carefully, noting the expected increases in my utility bill. The investment was paying off exactly as I had calculated. Then came the first signs that something was amiss. Arriving home from work one evening, I noticed the charging cable was not exactly as I had left it. The handle felt warm, as though recently used. I dismissed it as paranoia until I checked my electricity meter and noticed unusual spikes during hours when I was not home. The following week, I found unfamiliar fingerprints on the charging handle, smaller than mine, with traces of red nail polish. A seed of suspicion took root as I recalled Karen's unusual interest in my charging station. That suspicion grew stronger when I noticed her daughter's hybrid SUV parked in Karen's driveway more frequently. Something was happening when I was not home, and the sanctuary of my new property was beginning to feel violated. The dream of peaceful suburban living was showing its first cracks, hairline fractures in what I had believed would be my perfect home. The suspicion gnawed at me for days. Was someone really using my charging station without permission, or was I becoming unreasonably paranoid? I needed definitive proof before making accusations. After researching my options, I purchased a small motion-activated camera and concealed it within a decorative plant holder with a clear view of the charging station. The setup was discreet but effective, designed to capture anyone approaching the charger. The first notification came to my phone the very next morning, shortly after I had left for work. I waited until my lunch break to review the footage, not fully prepared for what I would discover. The video was crystal clear. Karen Jenkins, still dressed in her morning tennis outfit, drove her daughter's hybrid SUV into my driveway at 8:37 a.m. With practiced efficiency, she connected the charging cable to the vehicle, checked her watch, and then walked back to her house next door. 4 hours later, she returned, disconnected the cable, and drove away. The audacity was breathtaking. Over the next week, the camera captured similar incidents on 3 separate occasions. Each time followed the same pattern. Karen would wait approximately 20 minutes after my departure for work, then help herself to my electricity. My initial shock transformed into simmering anger as I compiled the evidence, screenshots, timestamps, and electricity usage data that corresponded perfectly with her visits. I decided to address the situation directly and civilly. On Saturday morning, I spotted Karen in her front yard directing a landscaping crew with typical micromanagement. I approached with a friendly wave, determined to keep the conversation cordial despite my frustration. "Good morning, Karen. Do you have a moment to chat about something important?" I asked, maintaining a pleasant tone. Karen turned to me with a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "Of course. Is there a problem with your property compliance?" I took a deep breath. "Actually, it is about my charging station. I have noticed someone has been using it while I am at work. My security camera shows that you have been connecting your daughter's vehicle to my charger several times a week." Her expression shifted instantly from fake friendliness to cold authority. "As HOA president, I have oversight responsibilities for all exterior installations," she stated flatly. "I was simply testing the functionality as part of our regular compliance reviews." "Testing it multiple times per week for several hours each time," I countered, showing her a screenshot from my phone. "This is my personal property and electricity that I pay for. I did not authorize anyone else to use it." Karen straightened her posture, her voice taking on an official tone. "The HOA board considers certain exterior fixtures to have community access implications. Your charging station was approved under our common area enhancement provisions." "That is not true," I replied, struggling to maintain my composure. "The approval documents clearly indicate it is a private installation. I can show you the paperwork." "Perhaps you misunderstood the terms," she said dismissively. "I suggest you review the bylaws more carefully. Now, if you will excuse me, I need to supervise this landscaping work." Frustrated but not defeated, I attempted to resolve the issue through proper channels. I sent a formal email to the HOA board detailing the unauthorized usage with video evidence attached. Days passed without response. I followed up with phone calls to other board members, but messages went unreturned. When I finally reached the HOA secretary, she sounded uncomfortable and evasive. "All exterior fixture disputes need to go through the president first," she explained hesitantly. "Karen handles these matters personally." The realization dawned that Karen had created a system where she was effectively untouchable. She controlled communication with the board, manipulated the rules to suit her purposes, and faced no accountability. Meanwhile, my electricity meter continued its abnormal climb, each kilowatt representing both a financial cost and a growing determination to fight back. This was no longer just about electricity theft. It was about justice and standing up to a bully who had been allowed to operate unchecked for too long. The utility bill arrived in an innocuous white envelope, but the numbers inside hit me like a physical blow. My electricity costs had nearly tripled compared to my careful projections. I spread the evidence across my kitchen table: 3 months of utility bills, installation paperwork, HOA documents, and printed screenshots from the security footage. The financial impact was significant. Karen had essentially stolen hundreds of dollars of electricity, and there seemed to be no straightforward path to restitution. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with, so I began researching Karen's situation more thoroughly. Through casual conversations with my neighbors, I discovered that Karen did not even own an electric vehicle or hybrid. The SUV she had been charging belonged exclusively to her adult daughter, who lived 30 minutes away but visited several times weekly. Karen was essentially providing free charging as a family perk, at my expense. That thing has been parked in her driveway almost every weekday for months, explained Michael from across the street, a retired teacher who spent his days gardening and observing neighborhood activities. The daughter drops it off in the morning and picks it up in her other car after work. Started right around when you moved in with your charging station. Has Karen always been this controlling? I asked carefully. Michael chuckled without humor. 10 years as HOA president. Nobody runs against her anymore. Not worth the harassment that follows. Armed with this information and determined to protect my property, I installed a simple keyed lock on the charging port, a modest security measure that required no permanent modifications. The lock was discreet, matching the charger's color, and I made sure it did not alter the exterior appearance in any significant way. The response came with stunning speed. The very next morning, an official-looking envelope was tucked into my door frame. Inside was a violation notice on HOA letterhead. Unauthorized exterior modification, security lock on charging station. The notice cited bylaw section 743 and threatened fines of $100 per day until the non-compliant modification was removed. I stood in my front yard, notification in hand, utterly incredulous at the brazenness of the retaliation. As if on cue, Karen emerged from her house for her morning inspection walk through the neighborhood. Clipboard in hand, she moved from house to house with predatory focus, noting the slightest infractions. A trash can left out too long, holiday decorations displayed outside the approved seasonal window, unapproved plant varieties in flower beds. When she spotted me reading the violation notice, she paused momentarily. Her smile was cold and victorious as she made a show of checking something off on her clipboard before continuing her patrol. The message was clear. She had the authority, she knew how to use it, and she was not afraid of escalation. That evening, desperate for advice or support, I took a walk through the neighborhood. A chance encounter with Lisa, who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac, proved unexpectedly enlightening. "You got hit with a violation notice already. That was fast, even for Karen," she remarked when I mentioned my situation. "Let me guess, something about an unauthorized modification." Surprised by her accuracy, I explained the charging station situation. Lisa nodded knowingly. Classic Karen playbook. She did the same thing to the Patels when they installed a security camera after their packages kept disappearing. Turned out Karen's grandson was taking them for his YouTube prank channel. As we continued walking, Lisa introduced me to two other neighbors with similar stories. Robert had received multiple violations for his vegetable garden until he discovered Karen was using selective enforcement to pressure him into voting her way on board decisions. The Jacksons had been fined for their basketball hoop until they agreed to host the annual HOA party, saving Karen from using her own house. "We have all been dealing with this for years," Robert explained, his frustration evident. "She knows every loophole in the bylaws and uses them like weapons. The few times someone stands up to her, she makes their life miserable until they either give in or move out." "Has nobody tried to organize against her?" I asked. The neighbors exchanged knowing looks. "3 years ago, we tried to vote her out," Lisa said quietly. The meeting was suddenly rescheduled without proper notice. Only Karen's friends showed up to vote. Then, coincidentally, everyone who had spoken against her received violation notices for the next 6 months. I returned home with new understanding. This was not just about my charging station anymore. It was about a pattern of abuse that had terrorized an entire community for years. In Karen Jenkins, I was facing an adversary who knew the system intimately and was not afraid to manipulate it for personal gain. But in my growing anger, I also found resolution. Someone needed to stand up to her, and it appeared that someone would have to be me. After weeks of frustrated attempts to resolve the situation through HOA channels, I decided professional legal advice was necessary. I scheduled a consultation with Patricia Lawson, an attorney specializing in property disputes and homeowners association conflicts. Her office was modest but professional, with walls lined with law books and framed credentials. I arrived with a meticulously organized folder containing all relevant documentation: the charging station approval, security footage, electricity bills, violation notices, and HOA bylaws. As Patricia reviewed the materials, her expression shifted from polite professional interest to genuine concern. "This is technically theft," she explained, gesturing to the usage logs and security footage. "She is taking your electricity without permission, which has a clear monetary value. However, HOA disputes exist in a strange legal gray area that often complicates straightforward claims." Patricia turned to the HOA bylaws, flipping through the pages with practiced efficiency. "The problem lies here," she said, pointing to a section on exterior fixtures. "While you clearly own your charging station, the bylaws contain intentionally vague language about community access to certain exterior fixtures. This section was likely intended for shared resources like irrigation controls, but the wording is ambiguous enough that Karen has found a loophole. So she can just take my electricity without consequences?" I asked incredulously. "Not exactly. You have a strong case for theft and trespassing. The challenge is that pursuing legal action against an HOA president often becomes prohibitively expensive and time-consuming. They can drain your resources using HOA legal funds, essentially your own money and your neighbor's money used against you." Patricia suggested attempting one more formal resolution through appropriate HOA channels before considering legal action. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, a perfect opportunity to address the issue with the full board and community present. I prepared diligently for the meeting, organizing my evidence into a clear, concise presentation. The community center was packed with residents when I arrived. Karen sat at the front table with other board members, controlling the proceedings with practiced authority. I signed up to speak during the open comments period and waded through discussions of landscaping contracts and seasonal decoration guidelines. When my turn finally came, I approached the microphone with confidence. "Good evening. I would like to address an ongoing issue regarding unauthorized use of my private electrical charging station and subsequent retaliatory actions when I attempted to secure my property." Before I could continue, the microphone suddenly cut out. Karen tapped her own microphone, which worked perfectly. "I apologize for the technical difficulties," she said with transparent insincerity. "However, individual property disputes are not appropriate for open comment sessions. Please submit your concerns in writing to the board for review at our next closed session." I attempted to continue speaking, but Karen spoke over me. Moving on to the next agenda item, community pool maintenance schedules. Several neighbors shot me sympathetic glances, but no one dared to speak up. The message was clear: Karen controlled not just the rules but also who got to speak and when. As I returned to my seat, defeated and furious, I noticed other board members avoiding eye contact, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge their president. The final breaking point came 3 days later. I returned home from work to find my charging station damaged beyond repair. The locking mechanism had been completely destroyed, with clear signs of forced entry. Fragments of plastic littered my driveway, and the charging port itself was bent at an unnatural angle. I stood frozen in shock, examining the deliberate destruction of my property with trembling hands. This was no longer just about electricity theft or bureaucratic bullying. This was vandalism, a criminal act. As I cataloged the damage with my phone camera, Karen's luxury SUV glided past my house. She slowed just enough to make eye contact through her window, offering a smug wave before accelerating away. That evening, I sat alone on my front steps as the sun set over Oak Ridge Estates. 6 months ago, this had seemed like my dream home. Now it felt like a battleground. I had tried reasoning, documentation, official channels, and even legal consultation. Each attempt had been thwarted by a system designed to protect those in power rather than ensure justice. As darkness fell, I made a decision. If Karen wanted to play by her own twisted version of the rules, it was time to find rules she did not know existed. This was no longer about fixing the situation. It was about outsmarting a bully who thought she knew every angle. I would need to be creative, strategic, and absolutely meticulous in my planning. The damage to my charging station proved to be a blessing in disguise. With the unit beyond repair, I had a legitimate reason to replace it entirely, and an opportunity to implement something Karen would never expect. I dedicated my evenings to intensive research, poring over HOA documents not just from recent years, but from the founding of Oak Ridge Estates decades earlier. My breakthrough came at 2:17 a.m., bathed in the blue light of my computer screen. While the HOA had updated its rules for modern technology like electric vehicle chargers, I discovered that the original bylaws contained detailed provisions about personal fueling stations, dating back to the community's founding in 1976. At that time, during the energy crisis, some homeowners had installed personal gas pumps. The provisions had never been removed from the bylaws, merely buried under newer amendments. Section 1283 of the original document stated clearly, homeowners may maintain period-appropriate personal fueling stations on their property, provided they meet safety standards and aesthetic guidelines consistent with the historical character of the community. A subsequent amendment from 1983 added, decorative or non-functioning fueling equipment is exempt from operational safety requirements if properly classified as architectural ornamentation. These forgotten provisions sparked an idea so perfect it made me laugh out loud. I would replace my modern EV charger with a vintage gasoline pump, one that looked authentic but would not actually dispense fuel. It would be classified as both a decorative fueling station and architectural ornamentation under the original bylaws, which technically still remained in effect. My search for the perfect vintage pump led me through online marketplaces, automotive forums, and eventually to Roland, an elderly collector who maintained a barn full of vintage gas station memorabilia 50 miles outside the city. His property was a museum of petroleum history, signs, pumps, oil cans, and promotional items from the golden age of American automobiles. Not many young folks interested in these beauties anymore, Roland remarked as he led me through his collection. What did you say you needed it for again? I explained my situation, omitting some of the more antagonistic details. Roland chuckled appreciatively at the creative solution. "I have just the thing," he said, leading me to a tarp-covered shape in the corner. He pulled the covering away to reveal a pristine 1965 Gilbarco gas pump, complete with analog dials, chrome detailing, and classic red and white coloring. This model was popular in upscale neighborhoods, has that clean, sophisticated look that might appeal to your HOA sensibilities. The price was steep but worth every penny. Roland helped me load the heavy pump into my SUV, along with maintenance manuals and period documentation that would prove invaluable for my plan. "Good luck with your neighborhood tyrant," he called as I drove away. "Nothing better than fighting bureaucracy with its own rules." Back home, I transformed my garage into a workshop. The restoration process was meticulous, cleaning decades of grime from chrome fixtures, rewiring the interior to include LED lights that would make the display glow authentically, and adding a hidden compartment for a new high-definition security camera. I carefully documented every step of the restoration with photographs and videos, creating a paper trail that established the pump as a legitimate historical artifact rather than a hasty modification. The most crucial element was paperwork. I registered the pump with the County Historical Society as a preserved historical artifact, complete with documentation of its provenance and restoration. I filed notification of a decorative architectural installation with the county permit office, carefully citing the relevant historical preservation exemptions. Most importantly, I prepared a comprehensive packet referencing the original HOA bylaws regarding personal fueling stations and decorative historical fixtures. Timing would be essential for the installation. Through casual conversation with the HOA secretary, I learned that Karen and several board members would be attending a 3-day regional HOA leadership conference the following week. This would provide the perfect window for installation without immediate interference. The vintage pump was heavy, requiring the help of 2 friends to move it into position. We worked efficiently in the early morning hours, removing the damaged modern charger and installing the gleaming vintage pump in its place. By dawn, the transformation was complete. The 1965 Gilbarco stood proudly in my driveway, looking as though it had been there for decades. The polished chrome caught the morning light, and the vintage Gulf Oil logo added a perfect touch of mid-century nostalgia. I stood back to admire the installation, mentally rehearsing the inevitable confrontation to come. Behind the decorative facade, a modern EV connector remained hidden in a concealed compartment, accessible only with a special key. More importantly, a high-definition camera was perfectly positioned to capture every interaction with the pump. The trap was set. All that remained was to wait for Karen to return and discover that her free electricity source had been replaced by something she could not possibly have anticipated. As the sun rose over Oak Ridge Estates, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Karen Jenkins was about to learn that sometimes the oldest rules provide the best protection against those who abuse their power. Karen returned from the HOA conference on Thursday afternoon. I was at work, but my new security system sent a notification to my phone the moment she approached my driveway. I watched the live feed with barely contained excitement as her luxury SUV pulled alongside the vintage gas pump. The camera captured her expression perfectly, the confident stride toward the usual charging spot, followed by a double take and visible confusion at finding the gleaming gasoline pump where the modern charger had once stood. Her reaction exceeded my wildest expectations. Karen circled the pump with increasing agitation, tugging experimentally at the nozzle, examining every angle of the installation. She pulled out her phone, presumably to document this unapproved modification, then spent several minutes apparently searching through documents or emails. The confusion on her face gradually transformed into calculation as she stalked back to her house, already planning her response. I returned home early that evening, parking conspicuously in my driveway beside the vintage pump. As I expected, Karen wasted no time in confronting me. She emerged from her house within minutes, clipboard already in hand, her face set in its official expression of disapproval. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, gesturing at the gas pump with unconcealed outrage. This installation was not approved by the architectural committee or the board. I noticed several neighbors had conveniently found yard work to do within earshot. Michael across the street was trimming hedges that did not need trimming. Lisa from the cul-de-sac was suddenly interested in collecting her mail, despite having done so hours earlier according to my security footage. "Good evening, Karen," I replied calmly. "Is there a problem with my vintage decorative fueling station?" "This is a clear violation of at least 6 different HOA provisions," she declared, already writing furiously on her citation form. "Unapproved exterior fixture, inappropriate aesthetic elements, removal of approved equipment, potential safety hazards." "Before you continue," I interrupted politely, "I believe you should be aware that I have some information to share with you." I retrieved a leather portfolio from my car and opened it on the hood. "First, I would like to address the matter of my previous charging station." I laid out printed photos from my security camera showing her using the charger, detailed electrical usage statements highlighting the periods of theft, and repair estimates for the damaged equipment. This is documentation of at least 17 instances of unauthorized access to my property and theft of electricity valued at approximately $340 over 3 months. I explained in the same measured tone she often used when issuing violations. Additionally, I have evidence strongly suggesting deliberate vandalism of my property. Karen's face flushed, but she quickly recovered. "That is completely irrelevant to this current violation," she snapped. "This gasoline pump is absolutely forbidden under our community standards. I am issuing an immediate removal order and will be recommending special assessment fines at the maximum allowable rate." Her finger jabbed toward the gas pump as her voice rose to that familiar commanding tone. "This will be removed within 24 hours, or you will face daily compounding penalties." Several more neighbors had gathered at a respectful distance, pretending to engage in casual conversation while watching the confrontation unfold. The audience clearly made Karen uncomfortable, but she was too committed to back down now. "Regarding the pump," I continued calmly, turning to the next section in my portfolio, "I believe you will find everything is in perfect compliance with applicable regulations." I produced the County Historical Society documentation and original HOA bylaws with highlighted sections about period-appropriate decorative fixtures and grandfather clauses for fueling station replicas. The documentation was meticulous, with every relevant provision tabbed and annotated. Section 1283 of the original Oak Ridge Estates bylaws, which has never been formally revoked, explicitly permits period-appropriate personal fueling stations, provided they meet aesthetic guidelines consistent with the historical character of the community, I explained. Additionally, the 1983 amendment states that decorative or non-functioning fueling equipment is exempt from operational safety requirements if properly classified as architectural ornamentation. I handed Karen the authenticated copy of the original documents bearing the official seal of the county record's office. Her eyes widened as she scanned the provisions she had clearly never encountered before. This is a historical replica properly registered with the County Historical Society, I continued, producing the official certification. It is classified as architectural ornamentation and meets all safety requirements for non-functioning decorative equipment. I have filed all appropriate paperwork with both county offices and maintained complete photographic documentation of the restoration process. The neighbors had grown silent, watching Karen's authority visibly deflate. Her face flushed deeper as she realized she had been outmaneuvered within the very regulatory framework she had wielded against others for years. "These are obscure, outdated provisions," she sputtered. "They have been superseded by modern guidelines." "Actually," I replied, turning to the final section of my portfolio, "according to HOA legal precedent established in Lakeside Community Association v. Rodriguez, 2019, original covenant provisions remain enforceable unless explicitly revoked through proper procedure. There is no record of these provisions ever being formally revoked." Karen stared at me with a mixture of shock and fury. For perhaps the first time in her decade as HOA president, she found herself without a procedural escape route. The crowd of neighbors had grown, their presence a silent referendum on years of accumulated grievances. "This is not over," she hissed, turning to leave. "The board will address this at the next meeting." As she stormed back to her house, I noticed several neighbors giving me subtle nods of approval. The first battle had been won, but I knew the war was far from over. Karen would not surrender her power without a fight. News of the confrontation spread through Oak Ridge Estates with remarkable speed. By the following morning, my phone was buzzing with text messages from neighbors I had barely spoken with before. Some offered congratulations, others wanted to know how I had found the original bylaws, and a few shared their own stories of run-ins with Karen. What had begun as a personal dispute over an EV charger had catalyzed something much larger, a community finally ready to challenge years of petty tyranny. Lisa from the cul-de-sac organized an informal gathering at her home that weekend. What I expected to be a small group of 5 or 6 turned into more than 20 neighbors crowded into her living room, each with their own Karen story to tell. She threatened to fine me $500 for planting native wildflowers instead of the approved hybrid roses, shared Alina, an older woman who had lived in the community since its founding. Said they attracted undesirable insects, even though they were specifically recommended by the county conservation program. Robert, whom I had met earlier, brought documentation of selective enforcement, photographs showing identical violations that received dramatically different responses depending on Karen's personal relationships with the homeowners. Most disturbing were the financial discrepancies that Michael had uncovered through careful review of HOA financial statements. "Notice how the landscaping contract doubled 3 years ago," he pointed out on the spreadsheets he had compiled. "The new company is owned by Karen's brother-in-law. No competitive bids were ever submitted." As the stories accumulated, it became clear that Karen's reign had created a culture of fear and compliance that extended far beyond normal HOA functions. The group decided to petition for an emergency board meeting to address leadership concerns, citing bylaws that required such a meeting when requested by 15% of homeowners. Within 24 hours, we had signatures from nearly 40% of the community. Karen attempted to block the meeting on procedural grounds, but the overwhelming community response and the presence of 2 board members who had finally found the courage to challenge her forced her hand. The meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday evening at the community center. The night of the meeting arrived with a tension that could be felt throughout the neighborhood. The community center was filled beyond capacity, with residents standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Karen sat at the front table with the other board members, her expression a mask of cold authority, though I could detect uncertainty in her eyes as she surveyed the unprecedented turnout. The meeting began with Robert presenting the petition for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA president, citing specific violations of fiduciary duty and abuse of authority. Karen attempted to dismiss the charges as unsubstantiated complaints from a small faction of dissatisfied residents, but her words were met with a ripple of derisive laughter from the crowd. One by one, neighbors rose to speak. They presented evidence of selective enforcement, financial irregularities, procedural violations, and personal vendettas carried out through HOA mechanisms. Most damning was testimony from the HOA secretary, who finally revealed how Karen had systematically buried complaints and manipulated meeting minutes to serve her agenda. The board members, sensing the shift in power, began to distance themselves from their once untouchable president. When the vote finally came, it was decisive. Karen was removed from her position effective immediately, with an interim president to be appointed until formal elections could be held. As Karen gathered her belongings under the supervision of two board members assigned to oversee the transition of records and accounts, the community erupted in spontaneous applause. Years of accumulated fear and frustration dissolved into relief and cautious optimism about the future of Oak Ridge Estates. In the weeks that followed, a transformation swept through the neighborhood. A committee was formed to review and modernize the bylaws, eliminating outdated provisions while ensuring fair and transparent enforcement. The financial records underwent a thorough audit, resulting in several contracts being rebid at substantial savings to the community. As for me, I installed a new, secure EV charging station beside my vintage gas pump, which remained as both functional art and a monument to creative problem-solving. The pump became something of a neighborhood landmark, with new residents often being told the story of the gas pump that took down a tyrant. One evening, about a month after the emergency meeting, I was admiring my unusual driveway setup when Lisa stopped by during her evening walk. "You know, we would never have found the courage without that," she said, nodding toward the vintage pump. "Sometimes standing up to a bully just needs one person willing to think differently." As the neighborhood continued its recovery, with new EVs appearing in driveways throughout the community, and a genuinely collaborative HOA emerging from the ashes of Karen's regime, I often reflected on an important truth. Justice sometimes requires not just confrontation, but imagination. In fighting a system designed to protect those who abuse it, the most powerful weapon is often creative thinking, and the courage to use rules in ways their creators never anticipated. The vintage gas pump stands in my driveway to this day, not just as a conversation piece, but as a reminder that sometimes fighting fire with gasoline is exactly what justice requires.